All right, welcome back to the 1045 session. My name is Bill Bolin. I am the director of the Cheval Center for Community Engagement and Learning here at King's, and also one of the leaders of King's About Face campaign, which I'll tell you a little bit about before I introduce our speakers today. This is an effort that was done with a generous grant from the All One Foundation. Its purpose is to educate people, especially college-age students, and help them get help for opioid use disorder. Our three pillars are, yes, that we're going to educate people on how people become dependent on opioids, to change the language we use when we're talking about opioid use disorder, and specifically to try to change some of the sometimes stigmatizing language that we use about OUD, and yes, let people know where they can get help. This effort began with a concerted drive by King's College community to see, where we could make the biggest difference in our community. We surveyed our faculty, our staff, and especially students. And the opioid crisis was the #1 issue that came up. And in the subsequent years since that survey was conducted and since we've convened community members, we have seen a lot what our first presenters talked about in the opening session, that a sense of community, a sense of belonging is really sorely lacking among the people in our area who are struggling with OUD. And an attempt to create community is something that should be at the foremost of our minds when we're trying to address these types of crises. And so I am so pleased today to be able to introduce Dr. Joel Shuman and also Kristen Topolski, who have done so much not only to let this community know about the severity and the tragic consequences of the opioid use crisis, but also to create this sense of belonging and the necessity for it in our community, to make us aware of the necessity for it. I want to encourage you, you may see on your tables, there are little white and purple postcards that talk about the opioid use disorder campaign. We have the About Face campaign. We invite you to go on social media and join or like our pages so you can learn more about it. So without further ado, I would like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. As I said, our first speaker for this session, again, is Joel Shuman, professor of theology at King's College, where he has taught for the past 21 years. A native of West Virginia, he was raised on the subsistence farm that his maternal great-great-grandparents homesteaded in the decade before the American Civil War. He attended Bethany College, West Virginia, and went on to graduate from the program in physical therapy at the Medical College of Virginia in Richmond. After 10 years as a physical therapist, he returned to school to pursue his developing academic interests. He earned a master's degree in theological studies from Duke University Divinity School, Ph.D. in religion, with a concentration in theological ethics from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Duke. Lies in the intersection of moral theology with medicine and other applied sciences. Is the author of multiple books, and he is currently working on a book to be published by Cascade Press on the opioid crisis. Respondent is Kristen Tapolski, who has 27 years of experience in the social service field, focusing on program development, advocating for homeless and disadvantaged individuals, economic justice, and peer-modeled service provision. She built her career's foundation primarily with single mothers to address employment, housing, and educational. Her career continued with developing and implementing a transitional housing program for women and children, an emergency shelter for women experiencing homelessness, and various programs addressing basic needs, employment, housing, and serving individuals experiencing substance use disorders. Topolski currently serves as the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of New Roots Incorporated, which operates recovery support centers in Wilkes-Barre, Tamaqua, Pennsylvania. And if I know Kristen, there will be about 8 more centers in the next 3 months. These centers provide recovery support services that embrace a peer-based model. Additionally, she is the co-founder and vice president of Willow Foundation, which operates a day shelter for individuals and families experiencing or at risk of homelessness in the greater Hazleton area. Please join me in welcoming them both. Dr. Shuman will begin with his talk on the other epidemic during the pandemic, diseases and deaths of despair.
I warn you in advance, I have a tenuous and sometimes hostile relationship with microphones. I'll do my best. Thank you all for being here. To Bernard and the planning committee for this conference. Thanks also to Professors Cobb and Hoskins for their excellent work this morning. Like many others, my introduction to the other epidemic, that is diseases and deaths of despair, was part of my learning about the tragic convergence of hubris, greed, disordered desire, and despair we call the opioid crisis. That crisis began almost imperceptibly in the early years of the 21st century, noticed only by a few astute physicians, nurses, and public health workers in locales scattered across the country who saw that a surprising number of people in their communities or their states were dying unexpectedly and wondered why. As the number of deaths expanded into statistical significance and began attracting media attention, outlets frequently portrayed the opioid crisis as affecting those others. Members of the poor and working classes in places like the desert Southwest, rural Maine, the Mid-Atlantic Rust Belt, and especially my own native Appalachia. This perspective appeared to be borne out a few years later when the economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton noticed a marked increase in midlife morbidity and mortality, first of all, among marginally educated poor and working class whites, and coined the phrase deaths of despair to describe it. But the scourge soon expanded its reach into the suburban middle class. High school athletes, soccer moms, and professionals began to become addicted and to die from overdose. And people unaccustomed to being victims grew angry and demanded action, insisting that someone get to the bottom of what had become a major public health crisis. The pundits and experts who subsequently dominated the news cycle spoke about the crisis in terms of its demographics, its root causes, and potential solutions. Although nearly all of them agreed that the opioid crisis had become a public health emergency, their descriptions of it varied widely, as did their proposals for its mitigation. Many placed blame for the other epidemic on big pharma run amok, unscrupulous pharmaceutical corporations abetted by well-paid consultants. We all know the story of Purdue Pharmaceuticals, who made billions by spuriously assuring healthcare professionals and patients alike that there was an abundance of evidence that their drug, OxyContin, was safe and effective for treating both acute and chronic pain with virtually no risk of addiction. Those who saw Purdue as the arch villain maintained that the drug companies had to be held accountable, and government oversight over the prescription and distribution of narcotics tightened. And they were right to a point, for the drug companies were held accountable and oversight did increase, and the other epidemic hummed along as those caught in the grip of substance use disorder abandoned increasingly expensive prescription narcotics for heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl. Others insisted that the opioid crisis was a legal problem, an epiphenomenon of American streets being flooded with illegal drugs from overseas. They demanded greater border security and more aggressive law enforcement. Despite their penchant for overlooking, among other things, the checkered histories of prohibition and the American war on drugs, they too had something to contribute, if only because they called attention to the inadequacy of traditional approaches of law enforcement and the criminal justice system to drug-related crime, and the need for new approaches, including trauma-informed policing, alternative sentencing, and increased investment in rehabilitation programs and facilities. Still others, somewhat more introspective voices suggested that the opioid crisis was part of our collective problem with pain. We had become, they said, victim to our own outsized desire for lives free from every form of suffering and for a medicine that might fulfill that desire. The insights of these few suggested that there was a sense in which, to quote Pogo the Possum, we had met the enemy and he was us. The crisis, they argued, exposed the inadequacies of the current pain doctrine and called for its reconsideration. And they too had a point as far as their explanations went. Case and Deaton, meanwhile, continued their research on diseases and death of despair, largely undeterred by the expansion of the opioid crisis into the middle class. The data they uncovered was alarming, but hardly, at least to my mind, surprising. Significant sectors of the American population, including both white and Black middle-aged and younger adults, were dying at rates that reversed a decade-long trend of decreasing mortality rates. Initially, the researchers cited suicide, overdose, and alcohol-induced liver disease as the primary causes of premature death, and later also included heart disease and type 2 diabetes induced by increases in obesity, hypertension, and higher than average rates of smoking in some areas. Without denying that those who suffered these maladies had some role in their affliction, Kristen Deaton continued to insist and to show that these people suffered as they did partly because they were responding to trauma and its accompanying stresses by seeking relief and solace in the only ways they could imagine. The at best partial adequacy of these and other explanations for the opioid crisis was cast into sharp relief by the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic in the spring of 2020. As the pandemic became more serious and the number of infections and deaths grew at an alarming rate, the opioid crisis not only continued, but grew significantly worse, despite having largely disappeared from the news cycle. In 2020, the first year of the pandemic, there were more than 91,000 overdose deaths in the United States, an increase of nearly 30% over the previous year. In 2021, the number jumped to 107,000, another 17% increase. That rate has slowed, but only marginally. Estimates for overdose deaths in 2022 currently top 109,000. Case and Deaton's analysis, which is most clearly spelled out in their 2018 book, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism, gestures toward what I believe is an essential point about the opioid crisis and its role in the other epidemic. I describe this as a crisis of hope, which is a product of the policy level abandonment of the common good, the subsequent erosion of the social compact, the emergence of pervasive senses of isolation, alienation, and finally, despair. People are dying at alarming rate from overdose, suicide, and alcohol-induced liver disease because they are suffering the loss of many of the things that once made life matter and afforded them the hope that allowed them to carry on. Economic security, social stability, and the bonds of family, neighborliness, and friendship. This disintegration has been a long time coming. Diseases and deaths of despair are the creature of social and political forces that converged and established a trajectory toward the present cultural moment long before Case and Deaton coined the term. Passe Case and Deaton, the COVID-19 pandemic had served to exacerbate the epidemic of diseases and deaths of despair precisely because it has rendered those forces more conspicuous and powerful. I make this claim not only by way of conjecture, but also based on my own experience working in what I call a crucible of despair. In 1984, and it pains me to say that, I returned with my family to my native West Virginia to join a struggling physical therapy practice in Beckley, a small city on the edge of the state's southern coal fields. I was charged with cultivating relationships with local orthopedic surgeon and expanding the practice's census. Such progress as I eventually made came not from the physicians, though, but through relationships I developed with health and safety directors of some of the region's mining companies. Deep mining coal is physically demanding work done in ergonomically difficult circumstances, and miners frequently suffer traumatic and repetitive use injuries. The health and safety directors expressed concerns about the number of injuries, especially back injuries that their miners were suffering, and I suggested that I might be able to offer some help. They invited me to spend time in the mines, watching the work done and the equipment used to do it. And I did so. And as I did so, I developed a sense of the considerable stresses the work placed on the miners' bodies. I spoke publicly to miners and their foremen, suggesting ways they might lessen some of those stresses by making small adaptive changes to their equipment and doing simple exercises when they had a break or felt discomfort. And I began to see patients. There was an empty physical therapy department in a small private hospital in Welch, the county seat of McDowell County. And the administrators there came to an agreement with the owners of our practice to allow me to open an outpatient clinic in the facility. That clinic became a vantage point from which I witnessed both the beginnings of the long death rattle of the deep mining industry in Appalachia and the emergence of the conditions of possibility for the other epidemic. In 1984, Welch was well on the way to what it has since become, a place where pain and despair are ways of life. In her helpful book, What You're Getting Wrong, about Appalachia, Elizabeth Catt notes that since the 2016 presidential campaign, Welch has become an icon, one of national media's go-tos for images of rural poverty, working class despair, and the devastation wrought upon Appalachia, first by the coal industry and then by the opioid crisis. In 1984, people there had seen rough times plenty before, largely as a consequence of the cyclical nature of the energy economy. But there was an emerging sense that something different was happening this time, more ominous and more likely permanent. The price of metallurgical coal had fallen precipitously. And as extractive industries are wont to do when they've taken what they came for, mines had begun shutting down and companies pulling up stakes, leaving behind them broken landscapes, broken economies, and broken bodies. People felt helpless. They grew depressed, anxious, and angry, and began behaving like depressed, anxious, and angry people tend to behave when they feel helpless. Casting blame and engaging in all manner of self-destructive behaviors, ranging from substance abuse to domestic and other forms of violence. Most of my patients were miners who worked in or had recently retired from the few mines that remained open. The older miners, those 50 and older, especially regaled me with stories of life in the coal camps of their childhoods, past strikes, whiskey making, cockfighting, and snake handling churches in remote hollers. My introduction to classical music came through a retired morning who one morning quizzically repeated my surname and asked me, "You any kin to the German Romantic composer Robert Schumann?" When I confessed that I knew very little about classical music, he set out to educate me by loaning me dozens of the hundreds of LP vinyl albums he had accumulated in his years as a member of the Columbia Record Club. I fear that despite his efforts, I remain something of a Philistine where classical music is concerned. Clearly more to these folks than met the eye, yet what I remember as vividly as their stories is the brokenness of their bodies. Probably 80% of them had back injuries, and many had undergone at least one surgical procedure. They were in pain, usually chronic and not infrequently intractable. They moved slowly, tentatively, and unevenly. They groaned and grimaced, often exaggeratedly, as if to make sure I understood that they really, truly hurt. They allowed me to examine and work with them and did the exercise I showed and prescribed, at least there in the clinic. But rarely did they report feeling much better, nor for that matter, did many of them speak or behave as if they expected to get better. To this day, I'm haunted by my inability to do more for these women and men than I did. In part, my failure was simply a function of the extent of my patients' injuries and the limits, not only of my own clinical skills, but of the medicine of the day. But there were other factors at play as well. Many of the older miners had been injured so many times and hurt for so long that they accepted pain and disability as fixed parts of their identity. They'd seen their fathers and uncles and brothers suffering similarly and accepted pain as their lot in life. They were happy about it, but they complained sparingly, understanding their pain as part of the price of making a decent living in a place where decent livings had always been especially hard to come by. But the younger miners, those in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, tended to be a different story. They were anxious and often angry. They complained profusely about their pain, their physicians, the company, the union, and the state-run workers' compensation program. Many commonly came to the clinic smelling of alcohol. They asked me whether I could help them secure the narcotics their physicians had stopped prescribing, drugs like Tylox and Darvocet. Not infrequently, they spoke to each other in hushed tones about the availability of those drugs on the street. Other times, they were simply morose, confessing in unguarded moments that things were not well at home. Their answers to my questions about their pain were careful and guarded, as if they worried that something they might say would be used against them. These men and women were neither lazy nor malingerers. Neither, though, were they especially motivated to get well. Because they did not want to be well, but because they were unable to themselves well. For they had too large a stake in being sick. Physician and educator Norton Hadler has said, those who have to prove they are sick cannot get well. And that describes precisely the situation of many of these patients. They quite literally believed that they could not afford to get well, which robbed them of agency, dependent upon a system they did not trust. Isolated and trapped within a collapsing economy and a large healthcare and reimbursement system, these men and women knew that if they recovered, they faced probable re-injury if they were fortunate enough to have jobs to go back to. Many of them turned to chemistry as a way of obtaining a fleeting measure of relief from the pain of their injuries, to be sure, but also from more difficult pain, that of rising that a good life was no longer within. My failure to help my patients has at least two things in common with our collective failure to adequately address the other epidemic. First, both situations emerged and continue to exist within a society and its attendant political economy with no coherent sense of the common good, including a healthcare system that is largely of providing care to many of those who need it most. Second, both have unfolded in a culture where we have lost sight, it seems, of what it means to have or to be a neighbor. A culture where the lawyer's question to Jesus, pressing the story we call the parable of the Good Samaritan, and who is my neighbor, is not simply difficult or perplexing, but almost nonsensical. To make any headway against the other epidemic, we must first be willing to facilitate changes to our economy, our healthcare system, our communities, and our lives. These changes must at every level center the common good and take seriously the assertion made by the journalist Johann Hari in his book, Chasing the Scream. He says, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. There is a story about the great anthropologist Margaret Mead. It's one of those stories that if it isn't true, it should be. Who was once asked when civilization began. Her response was not to cite a wide-scale development like agriculture or writing, but to relate an anecdote. Years before, she said, archaeologists had unearthed human remains that included the skeleton of an adult with a well-healed femoral fracture. She explained that for someone with such a seriously debilitating injury to survive, they would have had to have been cared for extensively by others who would have tended to their injury, fed and sheltered them, dealt with their waste, and protected them from danger until they were able to move on their own. This was a remarkable development, she said, because it set humans apart from other animals for which so serious an injury was inevitably fatal. Civilization began, she said, when humans stopped abandoning seriously injured people and began caring for one another in cases of debilitation. Which is to say, human civilization was born of empathy and compassion, the very things that will sustain it into the difficult, uncertain future we now face. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre argues that precisely because we humans are animals, we are fragile, vulnerable to affliction, and inherently dependent, meaning we flourish or fail to flourish by virtue of the ministrations of others. Such ministrations are many and varied, ranging from the care that parents give their children to the care healthcare professionals give their patients, to common everyday acts of neighborliness and caring for one another in times of serious need. All of these are inconceivable apart from empathy and compassion. My insistence on the indispensable centrality of empathy and compassion should not be understood as a dismissal or disparagement of professional and policy level responses to the other epidemic. Such responses ought also, to the extent that they can, be driven by empathy and compassion. Our social policy ought to reflect the fact of our inherent connectedness and interdependence and the web of reciprocal benefits and obligations it entails. To the greatest extent possible, economic policy should allow us all to make a healthy living without doing irreparable harm to our bodies, our households, our neighbors, neighborhoods, and our places on earth. Case indeed is right to point to the dissolution of social institutions and communities as implicated in diseases and deaths of despair, but they are wrong to downplay the role played by those economic inequalities wrought by policies that are at best indifferent to the well-being of working people. Households fall apart and people seek relief in substances when the jobs that pay them a living wage with good benefits disappear, and they are overwhelmed by the stress of working multiple jobs at substandard wages and accumulating soul-crushing debt. People also experience despair when they are sick or in pain and unable to access or afford the care they need most. Our healthcare system must be reformed to provide the care we need while freeing us from the specter of illness becoming an economic disaster, something that's now the case for most of us, says the writer-activist Wendell Berry, whether we have insurance or not. Case and Deaton themselves, incredibly strong advocates of free market economies, acknowledge that, quote, the generally powerful arguments for the social benefits of free markets do not apply to healthcare. They say this even as they squeamishly recoil from the prospects of a single-payer healthcare system. Empathy and compassion should also, and perhaps especially, ground our policy-level responses to the opioid crisis, where we need more rather than fewer drug courts and alternative sentencing options, city, county, and state levels, more recovery and treatment programs in the communities and in jails and prisons, more law enforcement personnel trained in trauma-based policing. We need more harm reduction programs, including widely available naloxone to reduce overdose deaths, and needle exchange programs to stem the rise of hepatitis C and HIV. We need more comprehensive treatment programs for those who seek recovery, incorporating well-managed medically assisted treatment, recovery counseling, peer counseling, and personal accountability. But none of these things, nor even all of them together, will overcome the other epidemic or end the opioid crisis. Large-scale technocratic approaches, important as they are not sufficient to heal the wounds the other epidemic has inflicted. Wendell-Berry warns about us depending too much on what he calls that will-o'-the-wisp, the large-scale solution to the large-scale problem, which he says is so dear to governments, universities, and corporations, and serves to distract people from the small private problems that they may, in fact, have the power to solve. Most ordinary people who find the will to engage the other epidemic do so not because it's a national, state, or city problem. They get involved because it is a problem that is destroying their communities, their neighborhoods, and their families, which suggests we should learn to understand community organizing or something very much like it as a practice of healing. And if you're familiar with the precepts of community organizing, you know that the first of these is to shut up and listen. A word of caution is in order here. I'm not advocating rebuilding broken communities by returning to the way things used to be in some imagined golden age. That would be inadvisable even if it were possible. Those who suggest that the other epidemic is the product of community disintegration, simpliciter, something that can be repaired by a program of moral bootstrapping, misunderstand the things that make a vibrant community. Further, says Alistair McIntyre, it's a mistake to suppose that there's anything good about local community as such. While the scale and interpersonal character of local communities makes possible ways of life that are conducive to restoring wholeness, such communities can be toxic, made so by bigotry, selfishness, and all forms of viciousness, including those that arise from the cult of local community. And yet, for those of us who are not policymakers, epidemiologists, or addiction recovery experts, our engagement with these crises begin at what Berry calls the scale of our competence. That scale is small, existing at the level of local communities, neighborhoods, households, and friendships. It depends neither upon more material resources nor professional expertise, but upon love. Love, Berry says, is never abstract, isn't cosmic, national, or institutional. Rather, it is extended by particular people to particular people. The mundane character of love, he concludes, is not by its own desire heroic. It's heroic when it is only compelled to be. Otherwise, it exists by its willingness to be anonymous, humble, and unrewarded. And yet, if I might engage in a little bit of theologizing, love is our very best hope. It is the fundament of empathy and compassion. It's a tenet of all three of the Abrahamic faiths that God is committed without reservation to our well-being as members of a beloved creation that he has called good. Barry, drawing from the deepest roots of the Christian tradition, avers, the world was created and approved by love. It subsists, coheres, and endures by love. And insofar as it is redeemable, it can be redeemed only by love. I believe that divine love, he says, incarnate and indwelling in the world, summons the world always toward wholeness. Love's opposites, which pervade the other epidemic, are isolation, alienation, and finally, loneliness. Healing, being made whole, entails being reclaimed and remembered from the exile of loneliness. To be healed is to be gathered again into the communion for which we are made, turning away from isolation toward what we are made to be, which is members of one another. Barry asserts that the thing most often standing between sickness and healing is not disease, but despair, a wound that cannot be healed because it is encapsulated in loneliness, surrounded by speechlessness. He continues, healing is impossible in loneliness. It is the opposite of loneliness. Conviviality is healing. To be healed, we must come with all the other creatures to the feast of creation. Beyond spheres of romance and familial affection, love appears to us most often clothed as friendship. One important strand of Christian tradition holds that friendship is the mode of God's work in the world. Jesus called his disciples friends, saying, I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing, but I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from the Father. Thomas Aquinas said that love, the greatest of the virtues and their very form, was nothing other than friendship with God, the maker and sustainer of heaven and earth, the beginning and end of all that is, calls upon his creatures to be, in a sense that defies our comprehension, his friends. And having befriended us, he calls upon us to widen the circle of friendship by befriending others, especially those others most in need of healing love. Love look like? Well, someone said to me once that if we really care about the poor, we'll know their names. That same truth can be extended to those who suffer the devastation of addiction and other diseases of despair. If we really care about them, we'll know their names, which is to say, we'll offer our presence, becoming part of their lives as we are invited, and joining them as friends while they struggle daily with the menaces of addiction and despair. Most of us, I think, understand that addiction is more illness than moral failure. That's an important distinction insofar as it keeps us from moralizing and victim blaming. But from the perspective of love, it is largely beside the point, because love is tireless in its tearing down of distinctions in us and them, the righteous and the unrighteous, the givers and the takers, the worthy and the unworthy. As Alistair McIntyre claims, we are all in one way or another disabled. He says, different individuals disabled in different ways and degrees can have their own peculiar talents and possibilities and their own difficulties. Each, therefore, needs others to take note of her or his particular condition. And this is one of the points at which it's important to remember that there is a scale of disability on which we all find ourselves. Disability is a matter of more or less, both in respect of degree of disability and the time period in which we are disabled. And at different periods of our lives, we find ourselves often unpredictably at very different points on that scale. When we pass from one such point to another, we need others to recognize that we remain the same individuals that we were before making this or that transition. These friendships among the more and less conspicuously disabled, including those disabled by diseases of despair, are inherently difficult, require time and effort, often will be painful. Further, they are no panacea. Not only do they not guarantee success, they're likely often to be instances of joining in what the late Dr. Paul Farmer, when speaking of his work to offer healthcare to the world's poor, called the long defeat. But this should not deter us, for we should already know that any life, including and perhaps especially the kind of life that's worth living, is bound to be difficult and to include a measure of pain. But that difficulty and that pain are made bearable and even redeemed by love. Thank you.
Hello. February 13th, 2009, a mother's phone rings. The voice on the other end stated that there had been an accident to get to the hospital right away. The term soccer mom could not more accurately describe this mother, how this mother had raised her children. Even as her children grew into young adults, they were her life. That cold February day, her life changed forever. Her 22-year-old son had lost his life when another car crossed the center line of the highway. Before she left the hospital, her family doctor gave her some medication to get through the days and weeks ahead of her. For months, she took this medication in hopes that the numbness it provided would not wear off. This is where addiction starts, trauma. Eventually, she began taking more medication than prescribed. She purchased pills from her friends and later found herself in the grips of a heroin addiction. As her addiction spiraled, she lost everything. Her marriage ended in divorce. Her children were not speaking to her. She was homeless and felt hopeless. On December 1st, 2016, she fell to her knees on a cold jail cell floor, facing severe felony charges. In those moments, she made a commitment to change her life. It wouldn't be easy, but neither was going through what she was going through. Today, I share these events with you, the lived experience of Carrie, a certified recovery specialist and the regional director of New Roots. My name is Kristen Topolski. I am the co-founder and chief executive officer of New Roots. The initial goal for New Roots was to create a resource hub for individuals and families impacted by substance use disorders that would combat the soaring number of drug overdoses in Luzerne County. A recovery support center would be staffed with Pennsylvania certified recovery specialists. These are persons with lived experience who work with individuals struggling with a substance use disorder on a peer-to-peer basis. Services would be available to individuals of the recovery process, and all pathways to recovery would be honored. Specialists would facilitate peer support groups, share their own recovery stories, advocate for peers, act as role models, provide crisis support, and act as liaisons with clinical providers. Additionally, certified recovery specialists would provide outreach and educate the community on the importance of peer-driven services. Was this the answer? I didn't know, but we needed to do something different, something innovative. In 2000, Luzerne County, by purchasing a site located in the facility, opening and operating the county's first recovery support center through the receipt of reinvestment dollars from Northeast Behavioral Health Consortium and Community Care Behavioral Health Organization. Initially, the targeted number of individuals served was 100 per year. In the first year of operation, New Roots saw 538 unduplicated individuals that had been impacted by a substance use disorder. The need for social connections to complex issues such as untreated mental illness. Individuals seeking services also ranged from those with several years of sobriety that were feeling disconnected to individuals that were actively using drugs and didn't know where else to turn. The certified recovery specialists assisted these individuals with various needs by developing goals, making connections to community-based resources, developing a system of natural supports, and assisting individualized recovery processes. Most importantly, there was a organization that emerged. The opposite of addiction truly was connection. Through identifying unmet needs, New Roots subsequently opened 3 additional recovery support centers in Hazleton, Tamaqua, and a satellite site in downtown Wilkes-Barre. Programming grew to assist individuals in meeting basic needs. Food insecurity was a barrier that individuals faced. Therefore, New Roots and the Food Dignity Project to have food pantries available at each recovery support center. There was a habitual buzz at the center consisting of support groups, life skill workshops, individual sessions, and recreational activities. A key component of a recovery support center is to develop links with treatment programs and community-based resources. Bringing resources into the center proved to be beneficial. With multiple social service agencies to provide on-site services. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic brought many in-person and group services to a screeching halt. The need for virtual, telephonic, and community-based recovery support services became vital. There was a feeling of fear, hopelessness among the individuals we were serving. New Roots again responded by mobilizing certified recovery specialists to make recovery support services accessible to the growing number of those in need. When group activities resumed, we again saw an influx of individuals seeking, you guessed, connection. While engaged in peer-based services, an individual develops and implements skills, competencies, and makes connections uniquely found in the recovery community that enhance the ability to begin or maintain long-term recovery. These opportunities grow and develop based on an individual's self-determined goals, abilities, and needs. SAMHSA defines peer support workers as people who have been successful in their recovery process who help others experiencing similar situations through shared understanding, respect, and mutual empowerment. Peer support workers help people become and stay engaged in the recovery process and reduce the likelihood of relapse. All direct service workers at New Roots are individuals with lived experience. He was a high school basketball star until injury placed him on the sidelines. The physical pain was unbearable. The emotional pain made him feel lost, scared, and uncertain about his future. Thankfully, or at least that's what he thought, there were pain pills that would help with the physical pain. Soon, the thought of, I need those pills, would not go away. Try this, he was told, and that night he snorted his first line of heroin. For a while, he hid his addiction from his family and friends and went off to college. In the college setting, things went from bad to worse. He wondered if he could make it out of the addiction alive. While seeking treatment, he was introduced to a certified recovery specialist, connected, set goals, and began his path to long-term recovery. Today, Shane uses his lived experience as a New Roots certified recovery specialist. The peer-driven model can be implemented in a wide variety of social service needs. In February of 2020, the City of Hazleton and the Hazleton United Way asked New Roots to provide drop-in shelter services to individuals and families experiencing or at risk of homelessness or facing food insecurity in the greater Hazleton area. This had been an unmet need in this community for decades. The COVID-19 pandemic brought to the forefront the urgency of a center. New Roots accepted the challenge and subsequently formed a 501c nonprofit organization, Willow Foundation. Again, the needs for individuals to make connections and to feel heard came apparent. This group felt stigmatized and marginalized. With a drop-in center day shelter, individuals now had access to breakfast, lunch, medical care, on-site laundry, transportation, and supportive services. Utilizing the peer-based model, staffed with lived experience with homelessness work at the Willow Foundation's Heartwood Center in Hazleton. Larry Fricks, Deputy Director of National Council for Mental Wellbeing, describes 6 key gifts that peer providers can bring to an integrated care team. Gift of insight. Internalized shame shatters a person's sense of self-worth. For many, the impact on their daily lives and interaction can be harder to overcome than the symptoms of their circumstances. Peer providers have insight on how internalized shame results from discrimination, social exclusion, poverty, homelessness, and hopelessness. 2, the gift of been there, done that. Peer providers eliminate the "you do not know what it's like" excuse. Peer providers can make others living with mental illness and/or addictions feel comfort in the fact that they are not alone. They have a person on their side who has been through similar experiences and has gotten through them. 3, the gift of compassion. Because of their lived experience, peer support providers understand and are inherently grateful for the very services they are now providing to others. This gratitude often manifests itself in deep compassion for their peers. 4, the gift of hope. Working with someone who has moved from hopelessness to hope is extremely empowering. People can often see themselves in their peer providers, which gives them hope over their whole health. 5, the gift of trust. Peer providers are in a unique position to develop a relationship of trust. Peers are often willing to share their real issues, concerns, hopes, and dreams with peer provider rather than with non-peer clinical staff. Gift of whole health self-management. 6, peer providers have developed the gift of self-managing their lives holistically, including both mind and body. This experience with self-managing their whole health is one of the most powerful gifts peer providers can give. They have learned to recognize triggers and early warning signs, counteract the negative impacts of stress, and create plans for taking care of themselves. At the recovery support centers and the Heartwood Center, we see these gifts in action every day. The conversations over coffee, the friendly games of pool, the shared experiences have a measurable impact. The individuals that come through our door are our neighbors. I firmly believe that peer support is the missing level of care that brings people with lived experience together to have a positive impact on their community. To date, New Roots has served 1,368 unduplicated individuals by suffering from a substance use disorder. New Roots is an approved provider of peer support in 31 counties throughout the state of Pennsylvania and receives funding from the Pennsylvania Department of Drug and Alcohol and fee-for-services from Community Care Behavioral Health. Willow Foundation has served 115 unduplicated individuals experiencing homelessness and is funded through emergency solution grant dollars and private donations. It's a late summer evening in 2021 in rural Pennsylvania. My phone rings. The call is from a fellow church member who lives in a farmhouse nestled between cornfields and a horse farm. I knew this family had been struggling with job loss and COVID-19 isolation. Kristen, please come quickly. I could hear the fear and desperation in her voice. I jumped in my car and arrived as she was on the phone with the 911 operator. 19-year-old son was laying on the floor from an apparent overdose. His breathing was shallow. I quickly grabbed the Narcan from my purse and administered a dose through his nose. There was a deep gasp of air, and he rolled to his side. I could feel the relief in the room. His mother turns to me tearfully, asking, "How did this happen to my family?" That evening, I sat on her front porch, and we talked about the fact that addiction does not discriminate. Later that evening, as I walked away from her house, I realized what meant more to her than the conversation we had was the connection we made. Therefore, to combat this epidemic, we need to focus on human connection and pull communities out of the depths of despair. Thank you.
Thanks to you both. You need, though, to come back, both of you. So, we'll again do questions through this mic here, and I'll do better this time to get some questions from the Q&A into our conversation, but I encourage people here, please, to ask away. Joshua, you go up there. Just make sure the mic's on too. I think it is.
Hello. Sound on? Hi there. I heard from both speakers about the necessity of addressing a wide variety of needs along Maslow's hierarchies of needs. Some of those have to do with physical needs, community needs, spiritual needs, and so on. I'd be very interested to hear from both of you about how the pandemic made you aware of both some of the possibilities and perhaps some of the limitations of meeting, especially some of those community needs virtually. We weren't able to meet together physically.
What?
You have something?
Sure. As a service provider, when COVID-19 started and we really needed to turn a lot of our services to a virtual format, it became difficult from the moment we started. Phone calls for food, for material assistance and things like that. So we mobilized, we did safe drop-offs with food pantry boxes on people's front porches. We would, assign a location, maybe that an individual experiencing homelessness that didn't have housing could meet some ready-made foods. So we really tried to improvise to make sure that those basic needs were met. And we tried to, again, meet the people where they were at. If we needed to meet at a park outside to talk with someone, our certified recovery specialist would sit at one end of the park bench and the individual we were serving would sit at the other. We knew we were going to lose lives and lose people if we did not quickly mobilize and make resources available.
I think, my experience of viewing things virtually comes from having to learn to teach online from the spring of 2020 through the spring until the beginning of the spring semester of 2021, and I loved everything about it. One of the things, just thought I had as Kristen was speaking was, we're bodies and our lives are embodied and we interact with others as bodies, ideally. As I understand empathy, it depends to a large extent on bodily presence. I don't understand empathy so much as placing oneself in the life or the shoes of another, but because we are both bodies, recognizing that another is in distress. And that's more difficult, much more difficult when you're not bodily present to each other. I think that may, as Kristen said, account for why things have gotten worse in the pandemic, because we're even not just talking about the administration of services to people in need, but the worsening of the conditions of make for the diseases of despair because we're unable to be bodily present to each other.
So I've been thinking about this during the first talk, so actually this might be open for any speaker. So one of the obstacles maybe we didn't really talk about today to what all of you are saying, right? So all of you are saying is there's got to be a better sense of community, right? It has to be community based on love, being a neighbor, etc. And at the same token, that's become more difficult, as you just alluded to, with the pandemic and some of the results of the pandemic, but also even going back to social media, texting, all of that. You know, Brian Stevenson, who was highlighted in the movie Just Mercy, gave us a talk at AAMC a few years ago. And to make real change, you need to be made to feel uncomfortable, a couple of the things he said, and you need proximity, as was said earlier. If you don't get your hands dirty, it's not going to work. So how do we accomplish those things that we talked about and try and do that and get proximity and be uncomfortable when the pandemic has shown us some things that may be not good? So for instance, you know, we struggled with the idea of mask mandates. Many of us wouldn't even feel inconvenienced by having to wear a mask for the good of the other. Didn't infect someone else, so I didn't spread this, right? So there was quite a number of folks who couldn't even get through that inconvenience, let alone feeling uncomfortable about someone else's position. And so I also thought in the isolation mode, we're becoming more and more isolated even now that we're coming out of the pandemic, because now we've discovered, wow, everybody can work from home just about. So we can all work from home. We don't have to go and walk through neighborhoods that would make us feel uncomfortable. We can distance ourselves. And when we're on social media, much of it's manipulated and manufactured, much of it isn't. We have to sort through that and then have to get to the idea of, well, I'm seeing these things that it's supposed to draw me into, right? So I'm going to see these things from across the globe, from across the world. They're supposed to make me feel uncomfortable. But then I can just scroll on and see something else that gives me a better dopamine hit and kind of leave that over there. And I don't have to do that. So I think that is an obstacle that was made worse by the pandemic now. And so how do we combat that to become neighbors again, to become a better community and to love in our society as it is now after the pandemic?
Well, one thing that I want to bring to your attention is you're looking at this when you talk from a very middle class standpoint, and that's where the majority of us in this room are coming from, that very middle class standpoint, you know, the work. When you look at Dr. Ruby Payne's work and you talk about poverty and you talk about people who are in the grips of addiction, they're not viewing the world in the same way that you're viewing it. They're viewing the world really from that mindset of poverty. Where am I going to find the next meal? How am I going to make it from point A to point B? Are there resources available to help me with transportation to get to the doctor? So they're longing for these resources to be in place. And, you know, somewhere like New Roots, when we're opening the doors and saying, you know, come to us and we'll help you move from that poverty level mindset into that middle class mindset, into thinking about all those barriers that you're thinking about. It becomes the place they want to come. It becomes a place where they want to gain skills, where their basic needs are met. So we're not seeing, when we're dealing with a group of people that are living in extreme poverty or addiction, we can't come at it with our middle class views. We have to come at it, what kind of life do they live? What kind of services are they looking for, and how are they getting to the service provider? How are we getting to them? How are we reaching out? So again, you know, are problems that we're experiencing in this room, you know, collectively real about connection and social media and all those other things that come to the forefront of our mind? Absolutely. Someone who's sleeping in a tent beside the river, they're not worried about their Facebook page, worried about where they're going to use the bathroom.
I think we're very to point out that this began before the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, that we began to separate ourselves. I mean, bowling alone. When was that? We began to separate ourselves from one another a long time ago. And there's so much about our societal structures and our culture that facilitate that. And the big thing is that about virtual life on social media, is that it doesn't just preclude conversation, it precludes listening. Because it's all reaction. It's all reaction. Friend who said that the comment section on online media is where compassion and reason go to die. And he's probably right. That community takes time, it takes presence, it takes patience, it takes a good ear. And so all those things, those are all skills we've lost and that we desperately need to begin to reacquire.
I'm just going to use the mic because I'm terrible at projecting. I too loathe teaching online. It's the worst. But yeah, it is. I think that what I learned from teaching online was the assumption that there was no connection. And I think I pushed back on myself, colleagues who say to me and others, well, the thing is, teaching online, I had to think about folks who are differently abled. I had to think about folks who had small children, who didn't have space to have a laptop here in the room, with other things. I had to think about all these other things, and that actually helped connect me to people's problems and issues. That actually helped me, it gave me a window inside of colleagues' lives that I had otherwise did not know. And from that connection, we've become friends, you know. And so I almost want to push back on like the no connectivity, because it's there, you know, if we grasp for it, if we look for it, if we remain open for it. And like I grinded my teeth. There's a lot of things that I took away from it. Isolation of COVID that I am, it's changed my world, and I can't unsee it, and I can't, yeah, I'm happy for that experience. I think it's made me more aware and present to others and their needs. So yeah.
You, everyone, all the health providers out there for getting us through this pandemic. And I'm glad Dr. Baracco brought up about the pandemic, because one of the things, as we talk about hope and despair, peer counseling, you know, one of the things I think bringing the communities together are openly. We have a whole generation of college students right now that have just survived a pandemic, and they've been there, done that, as Kristen has said. And we are here to help them and help them understand that. But I don't think we talk a lot about, we talk about mental illness. I think we have to talk about mental awareness and being aware of what's happening and having the conversations. But as we go through these next few years coming out of a pandemic, and we've gone through the uncomfortable state of wearing masks, and now it's okay. We've survived that. We've been there, we've done that. But we also have students out there that, life was great one day, and then all of a sudden they were moved off campus and they had to wear masks and they survived it, and they're my heroes and they've done it. But they're also dealing with some emotional traumas out there to make them aware. So how do we come together as a community? And I think having folks like yourself and leaders like yourself coming into our communities and speaking to our this college generation, I think saying to them, please put your phone aside and come in and have a conversation with me. It's okay to feel how you feel. If I had a broken arm and a broken leg, you'd be like, Christine, you're going to be okay. You're going to heal in 6 months. But I lost a brother to suicide. I lost a sister in a car accident and a father to cancer. So I know what my triggers are. I know that I have a community together, people I can talk to that have survived and been through it. But how do we connect with our community of our students? And I think us coming together and having conversations, not only today at this conference, but coming back and talking to our students and being open that you're human and you have those feelings. How you survived the pandemic at Lehigh Valley Health Network, you deserve a medal, and you had things that you had to deal with and you adjusted to. So I think being open with our students and coming together and saying it's okay to feel how you're feeling. There is hope. You might feel like you're in despair right now, but there is hope and you can survive it. And the one thing that got me through, my aunt was going through cancer and she was really down. And she came to me one day and she said, you know what? I was feeling sorry for myself. And then one day I thought, why not me? Why am I not there? So we've all been there and we've all had different things happen to us. And I think now, these conversations need to continue happening. And I think just relating and being open about things you've gone through and communicating. But I wish we could throw cell phones away. I would just ask any of you that have college students, send them a card. Send them a card, send your neighbors a card. We have to get back to writing postcards, writing letters and stuff and get away from technology. But I appreciate everybody here today, but I think these conversations need to continue within our classrooms, within our students. And I would ask Kristen to help us to have peer-to-peer counselors for our student to students to help them get through some of the hope that they have to not live in despair.
Thank you, Christine. So this might be abuse of power. We really should go to lunch very soon, but I have a question that I can ask. Am I allowed to do that? So, and then we're going to stop for Zoom. People will be back at 1 o'clock. So this is actually for Joel this time, though. Kristen, feel free to speak to it as well. Joel, there's just this one line that you used that was really striking to me. You spoke about a rising, nearly nihilistic despair that a good life was in reach. So you saw that among some of the people you saw in your practice. And just we think about, Aaron's discussion of the vice of despair. Your line suggests that this vice was nearly inflicted upon the people you were dealing with. So yes, they had developed it, but they hadn't developed it, I don't know, the way you might develop the vice of greed, let's say. It was more something that they came to suffer.
Right.
So I wonder if you just say a touch more about that.
I think that Aaron's distinction between feelings of despair and the vice of despair is useful without denying that some of my patients were gripped by the vice of despair, but it's habitually being placed in circumstances where you could not feel other than despair. And over time, that becomes part of your identity, especially when you are part of a community where despair is collectively typical. I mean, it was hard to find people who lived in this place, even those who were not afflicted necessarily, who did not experience periodic or regular despair. It was a very, very dark place even then, and it's become much more so since. I don't know that I don't know that a vice can be afflicted on us, but certainly the conditions of possibility for for developing a vice against our best intentions otherwise can be afflicted on us. And I think that's more what was happening there.
Right, here I am again. My new role. So lunch is in the room behind us there. Well, and if you're on Zoom, go have some lunch. Join us at 1 o'clock. And before you go, a couple things. If you ordered vegetarian or vegan, those should be clearly labeled. If you didn't order lunch, we have enough. So if you want it, please feel free. That goes for students too, for everybody. I'm sure we have enough. And finally, again, we really need to thank our speakers.